Welcome to Poetry of Immigrants. This is our 13th show, so we hope we don't get a case of triskaidekaphobia. And Frank Crowley, who is the founder of this show, is not with us this month. I think he left on his vacation on purpose, but I think we'll soldier on, Mark. Today, I'd like to thank Chris and Christy and Ken for bringing this show to being and helping make it possible. I'd also like to thank Frank Crowley for asking us to be co-hosts when he's not available. And I'd also like to thank my co-host, Mark McGuire Schwartz, for being here today. Mark is an English professor and a poet, and also one of the founders of Poetry Institute. Would you like to talk about any of that, Mark?
Well, first of all, thank you, and to Ken and Chris and Christy and Frank. The Poetry Institute is a place for poets and lovers of poetry to come once a month. We meet on the third Thursday of every month at the Institute Library in downtown New Haven, and people can come and read their own poems. And we also bring in a featured poet every month. And our main philosophy is we believe in poetry, all sorts of poetry. We try to bring in people who are members of our group to be featured readers, but also people who are local Connecticut poets and people from all around the world. We've had people from Greece and several places in Canada and England and Mexico and people who have all different styles. So if people are interested in poetry, it's a good place to come hang out.
I agree. I've been coming and hanging out for quite a while, and I enjoy it so much, so please come down sometime. So today we're talking about poets who write sometimes about poetry. I think sometimes about artists who like to paint paintings of themselves painting. Salvador Dali likes to do that, Norman Rockwell. Musicians who sing about writing songs, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and Mott the Hooples All the Way to Memphis, and many more. And sometimes even authors who write novels. The protagonists of their novels are often writers, like John Irving has done that many times in his books. So, and sometimes poets like to write about poetry. They like to write about the process. They like to delve into the idea of what poetry is or what it's made of or what rules it should and shouldn't have. And sometimes poets are inspired by other poets to write poems. So we're going to be talking about all of that today, and we're going to share some poems by poets, famous poets, and by poems that we have too.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right, so I'm going to start with a poem by Archibald MacLeish called Ars Poetica. The title is borrowed from Horace, who wrote a prose treatise about poetry called The Art of Poetry, and advised poets, among other things, to be brief and make their poems lasting. Okay, and MacLeish himself said that the function of a poem is to trap heaven and earth in the cage of form. And this is his poem.
You didn't tell me we were supposed to come prepared with wise things to say.
That's my only note.
Okay.
I started out with a note. Now, anything. Ars Poetica. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases twig by twig the night-entangled trees, leaving as the moon leaves behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. A poem should be equal to not true, for all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. For love, the leaning grasses, and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be.
And that is a classic poem about where a poet sits down to talk about how to write a poem, what a poem is. Interesting lines, but the poem is a flight of a bird. That's and we could go far on that, or a poem should be not equal to. It should be something other than what is written. Here's a poem on the same line, and this was by a mutual friend of ours, Richard Tejan, who's no longer with us, but he's writing about the first rule of poetry, and that's the name of the poem. The first rule of poetry is don't mention the words ear and Van Gogh in the same stanza. The first rule is don't mention Van Gogh. The first rule is forget your old neighborhood on 13th Street. The first rule is to show, don't tell. The first rule, even telling, is a kind of showing. The first rule is to eschew utterly egregious adjectives. The first rule is don't write about the news. The first rule is explain nothing in the beginning. The first rule is to begin in the middle, is to end in the beginning, is to begin at the end. The first rule, form emerges from repetition. The first rule, meaning emerges from variation. The first rule, poetry is repetition and variation. The first rule, if it can be paraphrased, it's not a poem. The first rule, each poem is an experiment. The first rule, if you don't fall, you're not, or if you don't fail, depending if these classes work or not. If you don't fail, you're not trying. The first rule is don't mention Van Gogh. And it's sort of along the same lines as
McLeish.
McLeish, although there is the irony in each line where a lot of the rules he breaks the rule by mentioning it. Don't mention Van Gogh and ear in the same stanza, and of course he has just done that.
Right.
Don't mention Van Gogh, now he's mentioned him twice.
Exactly.
Etc.
And about repetition. And both of them stress that a poem should not mean but be.
Yes, those lines echo.
They do, because if you can paraphrase it, it's not a poem. So that's when people say, what is your poem about? I'm always hesitant to say, or what was that poem about? Poems.
Well, I usually say something like hippopotamuses. No matter what the poem is.
It's about. That's a good answer. Okay, so I'd like to, this is another angle of what is poetry. It's a poem by Maria Wisława-Szymborska, who won the Nobel Prize in 1996. She was a Polish poet. This poem is called Some Like Poetry. Some like poetry. Some, thus not all. Not even the majority of all, but the minority. Not counting schools, where one has to, and the poets themselves. There might be 2 people per 1,000. Let's hope more than that. Some like. But one also likes chicken soup with noodles. One likes compliments and the color blue. One likes an old scarf. One likes having the upper hand. One likes stroking a dog. Some like poetry. But what is poetry? Many shaky answers have been given to this question. But I don't know, and don't know, and don't know, and hold on to it like a sustaining rail.
So, actually, that reminds me of the poems that I've been thinking about this topic for a while, and I started thinking about it when I came across a few poems that sort of echoed. They're not bookends, they're not the same. But here's one by, Szymborska is thinking about not just the poetry, but how it's received. So Emily Dickinson, and I'll get this wrong, but she published half a dozen poems in her lifetime or something like that. People knew about maybe 30 poems that she had written in her lifetime, and then after she's died, her sister finds the trunk full of 1,800 poems.
Yeah.
So it's the old tree in the forest. Do those poems exist if no one else has read them? And it could have been they would have been lost, and we never would have known Emily Dickinson. Boy, is that irrelevant. This is called Poem to be Read at 3 a.m. by Donald Justice. Excepting the diner on the outskirts, the town of Ladora at 3 a.m. was dark, but for my headlights. And up in one second-story room, a single light where someone was sick, or perhaps reading, as I drove past at 70, not thinking, this poem is for whoever had the light on. So it's a poem about a poem. Very little happens in this poem. He's driving through town and he sees a light on. That's the substance. And he thinks about, so there's a person in that room, outskirts of town. It's a second story. It's nothing special about this. And some people leave the lights on when they go away to scare away the burglars. So maybe there's no one there. Or people leave the lights on when they sleep. So maybe someone. But he says, we have two choices here. Either the person is throwing up. Either the person is going through the medicine cabinet to try to figure out which of these medicines he could take without having too much interaction, having too much Tylenol, because they all have Tylenol in them. Or someone could be reading a poem. One of the two sublime things, throwing up or reading a poem. And that's who his reader will be. Or maybe the person is not there, and there is no reader.
It's, to me, writing poetry is like a message in a bottle. It's always like a message in a bottle. Who's gonna really grok that poem? Who's gonna feel the essence of it? First of all, will it be...
Did you just say grok?
I did say grok.
Yeah, I told my classes about that word recently.
It's still a good word.
It still is. It's quite a word.
So, yeah, but it is. To me, that's my image, my metaphor for writing poetry. It's always a message in a bottle.
May I add another poem?
Absolutely.
So, this is Ted Kooser, also thinking about who is the reader. And he actually picks his reader, sort of selecting a reader. First, I would have her be beautiful, and walking carefully up on my poetry at the loneliest moment of an afternoon, her hair still damp at the neck from washing it. She should be wearing a raincoat, an old one, dirty from not having money enough for the cleaners. She will take out her glasses, and there, in the bookstore, she will thumb over my poems, then put the book back on its shelf. She will say to herself, for that kind of money, I can get my raincoat cleaned. And she will. So here's Kooser. He's going to pick a poet, pick a reader.
Right.
And he makes her pretty. There's also something slightly suggestive for her. She just washed her hair. She's not only pretty. A little while ago, she was nude and pretty. She's also lonely. So here's the reader who's going to really appreciate him. Except she appreciates washing her raincoat more.
Yeah.
So here, it's selecting a reader, and then he says, well, she won't read it after all.
Uh-huh. And that's the kind of, when you're describing what's going on in this poem, that's the kind of thing that poetry does. It uses a lot of shorthand to describe a lot of ideas or different ways the person can be thinking about what's going on with the woman with the damp hair, with the dirty raincoat, and it's kind of setting you up. But I think that is something that poets often think about, is like, how is their poetry perceived? Who's the audience? What really, what, even if they are writing for themselves, some people say they write for themselves, but if you write for themselves, all you really have to do is think it. You don't really ever have to put it down and share it with anybody. So I always question that, whether people really ever really write for themselves.
And Emily makes us think about that. Did she really want those 1,800 poems to be for herself in the trunk?
Yes.
Or would she have preferred to have more of a readership?
She did try to be published at times, but she did say, the soul selects its own society, then shuts the door on its divine majority. So I don't think she was ever concerned about a wide audience. But I think one of the first people we try to please is our teachers, or our professors, or our whatever.
I wish my students would think that way.
So this is one of my own that I'm going to share. But it also talks about what are the rules of poetry in a sort of negative way. They say in poetry that you should stick to one metaphor rather than throw a bunch of metaphors out in the same poem. That you should not overstate things in a poem. That you should not use Latinate words with Latin roots, because they're, I guess, too highfalutin or whatever. So this is all about making mistakes while writing a poem. It's called Other Uses. My form is dismally narrative, my similes too comparative, ideas vague and unrelated, ponderous and overstated. One gerund puts him in a snit, too violent, apoplectic fit. He fails to understand, to me, things happen more continually. No joy in creativity. My professor hates my poetry. Though I confess I'm not averse to crafting a more lyric verse. I have no talent to distill fine insight from a twilit rill. One metaphor I can't sustain from the poem's first line to last refrain. I'd add more. With varied uses, my train's all engines, no cabooses. Though I'm not jealous, Euterpe, my professor hates my poetry. Whom I address is most unclear. Too wordy are my words, I fear. Continuous lines like prose do read, perhaps at novels I'd succeed. My errors are irreversible, no knack for the impersonal, a penchant for hyperbole and misuse of synecdoche. Penultimate in tragedy, my professor hates my poetry. My Latin blood, its roots preferred, I shun the Anglo-Saxon word. Toss these pages to the hounds, I'm too cliché, way out of bounds. Descriptive galloping stampede, an editor is what I need. Haughtily his words advise, revise, revise, again revise. Though I suspect he fancies me, my professor hates my poetry.
And when you were reading that, I remembered a line from Joan Baez in her great song Diamonds and Rust. She's describing this, her youthful love for Bob Dylan. And she throws in the line, my poetry was lousy, you said.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Right, I remember, that's exactly. Yeah.
So not pleasing the teacher, but someone whose work you respect.
Yeah, that's hard. Okay, have you got another one for us?
Have I got another one? We have
lots.
So poets, there's so many different ways that poets talk about poetry. And I guess that's because people say, write about what you know about. So here's the poem. There we go. We're not going to look at that one. And I was going to... So one way poets talk about poems is by writing about other poets or writing about of a poem specifically. And of course, there's a term for writing about art, including writing about poetry, which is the word ekphrastic, a word which I talk about. So there's a poem I wrote about the poet where I start from, who got me started on poetry, sort of, anyway. And a big poet for me, Allen Ginsberg. And I'm talking about a poem he wrote and about poetry. Breaking the Rules for Allen Ginsberg. It's a 9-part poem. 1. Allen, I have been listening to a recording of a poem where you shout, I am the King of May, I am the King of May, again and again, and listening to you tell the story of that May Day celebration in Prague. And the last lines, where you tell about how the King of May is granted license to sleep with anyone he chooses. And I hear you say that you did not get to sleep with everyone, but that you tried. And that from Prague you flew to London to meet with Dylan and the Beatles. 2. I take the dog out for a walk. We talk, Lucy Dog and I, about my poetic rule that prohibits me from writing a poem about a poem. Every poet has those poems. Some have a little more. And the second rule that says to write about other poets only sparingly. And the absolute rule, never to use the term ekphrastic. Not in verse, not in prose, not in writing, nor spoken, never. 3. I am breaking the first of those 2 rules. The rule about ekphrastic stays. 4. Allen, I have heard you read Howl so many times. I used to play it for my brothers on that monaural record, on that little red portable record player, and Kaddish. You were so honest, so open. I learned from you above all others. But I do not write confessional poems myself anymore. Enough people mad at me already. 5. You describe yourself in Kaddish as childless. And I'm guessing you never owned a dog. I have just left a message for my son, seeing if we could get together for dinner tonight. Shortly, I will give Lucy a bath. Allen, I just listened to a poem where you describe sex with Neil Cassidy. And I picked up the dog's poop when he walked, just showing you I can be graphic also. 7, in the sex poem, you shower praise on Cassidy as a lover, not just of you, but for all the women he pleased. Coincidentally, I'm currently reading the memoirs of Carolyn Cassidy, who seems to have a different opinion. 8, I am the King of May, you shout, the King of May. I am the king of bathing the dog, I shout back. I am the king of dog poop. 9, Allen, we have led different lives. So that's my way to both pay tribute to the poet who meant so much to me, and at the same time question some of the things, some of his statements, some of how much hyperbole you do put in a poem.
And sometimes that is something that makes a poem interesting, although I don't know. Okay. Here's another one about, well, where I was going to go from there, I think I'm going to swerve a little bit. Okay. I'm going to read this one in the middle of it all, called As for Poets. I mean, if we're talking about Emily Dickinson and Allen Ginsberg, we know that poets are a wide variety of styles and people and backgrounds and just about everything. But I like Gary Snyder's take on poets. As for poets, the earth poets who write small poems need help from no man. The air poets play out the swiftest gales and sometimes loll in the eddies. Poem after poem curling back on the same thrust. At 50 below, fuel oil won't flow and propane stays in the tank. Fire poets burn at absolute zero. Fossil love pumped back up. The first water poet stayed down 6 years. He was covered with seaweed. The life in his poem left millions of tiny different tracks crisscrossing through the mud. With the sun and the moon in his belly, the space poet sleeps. No end to the sky, but his poems like wild geese fly off the edge. A mind poet stays in the house. The house is empty and it has no walls. The poem is seen from all sides, everywhere, at once. And I don't know, do you picture yourself as any one of those categories, or if you had to choose,
I have
or
a
no?
hard time picturing myself in any particular poetic group. I mean, I think I'm fairly all over the place.
All over, but you are unique in that you invented your own poetic form. Did you want to talk about that for a minute before we wrap this up?
But the odd thing is I am the farthest thing from a formalist that you could be. There is a whole movement in contemporary poetry where people are saying, I don't believe in this free verse, in this organic verse. I believe in the sonnet, in the villain, in the old forms, and it is in fitting into that old form is where you can release your creativity. And I always thought that was just so much nonsense. But I stumbled upon, I accidentally invented a poetry form, which is called the 17. And 17s have 17 parts to them. There's a lot more to it than that, but principle among the things about a 17 is that it's not a little poem. You have to have at least 17 things to say in one place. But it's also not Homer. It's not, and you don't write 1,000 pages unless they're long sections. So I've written quite a few 17s and have a book out of 17s.
Which is fabulous. Which is called?
289, of course, 17 squared. So I have no. So yeah, do we have a? So here are two poems.
Okay.
Changing the subject.
Okay, you want to do real quick? And
Real
we'll
quick,
go over
these are two short poems. One of the ways poets write about poetry is by two poets writing on the same subject.
Okay.
So one of the poets is me, and one of the poets is someone else, and we decided to then do them together. So as a group, it's called A Hawk Flies Close to Window, a collaboration by two poets. Part one, We Flinch by Mark, the person. Two hawks 15 yards away, their branch as high as this bedroom window. One jumps into flight, glides down, and then up towards the window, and so close. Two, Hawk by Isis, the cat. Bigger than me, and so close. So I was happy to collaborate with Isis, who was, as you see, a marvelous poet. Even though I'm embarrassed that she did much better poem there than me.
She certainly has the concept of brevity.
She has the concept of saying what needs to be said,
Okay.
not cutting out the other nonsense.
Well, thank you. We'll talk more about nonsense in the second half.
Excellent.
I'm Howard Schwartz from the Better Business Bureau serving Connecticut with a consumer moment. Consumers have more power in their hands than ever before. We can go into a store to find an item and then jump on the computer and click until we find the best price. Just remember, aside from the majority of legitimate businesses, there are criminal operations that put up sophisticated-looking websites that are designed to steal your credit card or other financial information. Even legitimate bottom-basement prices can sometimes be deceiving if you compare the costs of shipping and handling. Do your homework, take your time, and try to stick with well-known websites. Before you pay, make sure that the website address begins with HTTPS. S stands for secure, and you'll see a padlock icon next to it. That means the website is taking the steps necessary to protect your information. This consumer moment is brought to you by BBB Serving Connecticut, where you can start with trust.
Thomas, you've got prediabetes. But with more exercise and a change in diet, it can be reversed.
I've tried exercising. It just makes me hungry for bacon.
I love bacon too. And who really likes to exercise?
Not me.
Me neither.
Nobody. So we're good?
What? Oh, you still have prediabetes. Big time.
Oh, look, a redhead. Staring contest. You still got it. I know.
Come alive with the forest.
The dad was cute.
You were looking right at us. Visit discovertheforest.org to find a forest near you.
Kids will spend 15 minutes watching online videos like this one.
Brushing for 2 minutes now can save your child from severe tooth pain later. 2 minutes, twice a day. They have the time.
With newspapers and media outlets merging all over the country, communities are losing their local voice.
There's so much going on in the community that I think doesn't really, there's a lot of folks who are unaware of it. And I think things like this can bring it out into the community and in that way kind of bring the community together.
Information and to our residents is the key to good governance. And with the national media and local media not often covering us, this is an excellent opportunity for us constantly to communicate with our constituents and also to have them communicate with us.
The best outcomes will be achieved through a community-based organization that grows its operation and scale by means of locally produced programming.
All of our content is volunteer produced, so we do shows from talk shows to music shows, working with high schools.
VSC TV is committed to ensuring that the investment made to secure these powerful tools will pay great dividends in the community for many, many years.
Every day, the people in our community rally in support of United Way as we strive together to make a big impact to change lives in Middlesex County. From our main streets to our institutions, from our neighborhoods to our town halls and our classrooms, we're working with our partners to create a stronger community. It's an inspiring effort and we invite you to join us. Volunteer, donate, live united.
Okay. Welcome back to Poetry of Immigrants. Today we're talking about poems on poetry. Mark, what do you have for us now?
Well, I was trying to figure out why poems on poems are poems of immigrants, but I figured that poets are pretty much people who have migrated from the world of reality to that other place,
right.
The world of mystery and mysticism and wonder and imagination. And once they get to that place, then they write poems about paying bills and building tables and going to work, all the things that they left in the world of reality, doing the laundry. So I have something. Well, you know, I think you have something, which is
yes.
Another way that poets write about poets is they take the work of another poet and expand on it.
Okay.
And I believe you had something from our friend Emily Dickinson.
I do. Okay. I do. So this is a poem using famous phrases from Emily Dickinson, but imagining that I actually spend a lot of time in Amherst, where Emily Dickinson lived, and I visited her homestead. But I spend time in Amherst because my granddaughters go to school there, and sometimes if I am asked to pick them up after school, I'll be in a coffee house waiting the 45 minutes or whatever. So this is called Four Horsepersons Revisit Amherst. And I will indicate the phrases from Emily Dickinson by raising my finger. Because I could not stop for death, I met him at Starbucks for a latte. My strategy, much madness in divinest sense, was to meet death halfway. Let him decide it wasn't worth the effort. He ditched the scythe, sports an earbud now, but he was distracted from the whole reaping gig. Famine was texting him about a new line of celebrity cookware she was flogging on the home shopping network. The truth must dazzle gradually. In every take of the demo, she was deemed unappetizing. Her publicist come personal trainer scolded, "She's just too zero on the bone." Then Pestilence breezed in with her new squeeze, Fallout. The latter, a shady friend for torrid days, was rumored to be making a comeback. She finally got fed up with war, his zealotry and territorial jealous rages. She was looking for someone with more staying power. Though war's own publicity campaign is coming along nicely. It may be dreary to be somebody and inscrutable to be nobody, but it is absolutely crucial to be an army of one or a cavalry of woe with rusty ammunition. And it just doesn't reach its target demographic anymore. And I hear that Pestilence herself is doing just fine with Zika and gene mod salmon and TB and dengue fever. She still dabbles in animal vectors, and though the avian flu petered out, she remains convinced that hope is a thing with feathers. But the soul selects her own society, so I slowly back away from these jokers who are imps in eager caucus, who raffle with my soul, and in withdrawing, I bark my shin and press my palm to the scrape, lest anybody spy the blood.
Hope is the thing with feathers. That's, so one of the things you want to do when you write a poem is you want to write lines that are memorable, lines that are great. So it's a good way to do it is to steal those lines from Emily Dickinson. Or I have a poem where I use the lines of William Butler Yeats, and it's a poem about Yeats and where he lived and what he means to people in Ireland. But I use his lines. So I know there's some great lines in that poem, even if I didn't write. I love your poem. And so you were taking the line from Emily Dickinson and writing from that. So I took the liberty of taking your poem and writing from that. So I'm writing from two great poets, Gemma and Emily. This is called Franchise Mortality.
But not in that order.
Franchise Mortality, from famous lines by Emily D. and Gemma M. Because I could not stop for death, I met him at Starbucks, recognizing his eternal eyes, his particular pleasure in the word barista. He ordered a mocha morte venti ultra grande, and the barista knew him, accepted no payment, and threw in 2 cinnamon morte biscotti. Death was dressed casually, shorts and a button-down shirt jauntily opened at the collar. I exist on Starbucks caffeine, Death confided, asking what I'd have. I said I wasn't thirsty, but Death insisted. On me, he said, just this once.
That's a great poem. So you have to add yourself to the list there. Okay, I have a few on poetic process.
No, wait.
No? Oh.
But wait.
But wait.
You do. But just to show we are not the only ones who are starting with someone else's line. I remember, I know of 2 poems by Kenneth Koch where he does that. One which starts, something there is that doesn't hump a sump. Something about something getting stuck in the line between the house and the septic tank or something like that. And here's one, a variation by Coke, variations on a theme by William Carlos Williams. I chopped down the house that you had been saving to live in next summer. I'm sorry, but it was in the morning and I had nothing to do, and its wooden beams were so inviting. And just go on from there. So that's, I'm sorry. Where were you going?
No, I like that. So poetic process. This is called, it's by Eve Merriam, who writes basically for children, but I love her, and I love her, I shouldn't say but, and I love her poetry. This is a reply to the question, how can you become a poet? Take the leaf of a tree, trace its exact shape, the outside edges and the inner lines. Memorize the way it is fastened to the twig and how the twig arches from the branch, how it springs forth in April, how it is panoplied in July. By late August, crumple it in your hand so that you smell its end of summer sadness. Chew its woody stem. Listen to its autumn rattle. Watch as it atomizes in the November air. Then in winter, when there is no leaf left, invent one.
Mm-hmm. So here's Sharon Olds. And she speaks in this poem about why she writes, what it is to write. But she only does it at the very end of the poem. I go back to May 1937. I see them standing at formal gates of their colleges. I see my father strolling under the ochre sandstone arch, the red tiles glinting like bent plates of blood behind his head. I see my mother with a few light books at her hip, standing at the pillar made of tiny bricks with the wrought iron gate still open behind her. Its sword tips black in the May air. They're about to graduate. They're about to get married. They are kids. They are dumb. They know, all they know is that they're innocent, that they would never hurt anybody. I want to go up to them and tell them, stop. Don't do this. She's the wrong woman. He's the wrong man. You are going to do things you cannot imagine you would ever do. You are going to do bad things to your children. You are going to suffer in ways you never heard of. You are going to want to die. I want to go up to them there in late May sunlight and say it. Her pretty blank face turning to me. Her pitiful, beautiful, untouched body. His arrogant, handsome, blind face turning to me. His beautiful, pitiful, untouched body. But I don't do it. I want to live. I take them like male and female paper dolls and bang them together at the hips like chips of flint to strike sparks from them. I say, do what you're going to do, and I will tell about it.
So that is her poem about, that's very meta. She's writing the poem about that she can write this poem because she didn't prevent herself from going back to the future.
and all that about the innocence and about the things that happen which are less than innocent later on. Right. It's all the setup for here's why I write. Or I have to write because of this. Because I can't prevent my parents from having met. And I can't prevent war. I can't prevent all these things. All I can do is tell about it. That's, I think, what any poet does.
Okay, I'm looking for a poem by John Asbury that reminded me of that poem that you just read, only because it talks about family, and it is about identifying with that point of intersection with another person. See if I can.
So when I was preparing for this, I pulled out, I said, oh, I could print out all these things. And I started printing them out, but I said, I got to bring the books. I got to feel the books. So it's just
probably a
nice to pick them up. But the trouble with that is as I'm looking for the poem I'm about to read, I'm seeing all these other great poems, which have nothing to do with the subject. Once in the 40s by William Stafford, what a wonderful poem. What Work Is by Philip Levine. Keep looking. Okay. So this is another poem that got me going on this idea of poets thinking about poetry. I Stopped Writing the Poem by Tess Gallagher. I stopped writing the poem to fold the clothes. No matter who lives or who dies, I'm still a woman. I'll always have plenty to do. I bring the arms of his shirt together. Nothing can stop our tenderness. I'll get back to the poem. I'll get back to being a woman. But for now, there's a shirt, a giant shirt in my hands, and somewhere a small girl standing next to her mother, watching to see how it's done.
That, to me, the last line of the poem just brings it all together. Watching to see how it's done. What? Folded shirt, be a woman, be a poet, incorporating everything together, being an example to her daughter. She's doing all of that.
And the daughter is not even there. Somewhere there's a daughter. It's almost mystical. The idea of daughterdom, of passing this on. And the idea, the big idea, women always have something to do. Yep. And I'll get back to the poem. But will she ever write this poem? We're left wondering. And
well, I think,
somehow she has squeezed it in.
But I think that became the poem.
That is the poem, yeah.
And because we're talking about daughters, and because we're talking about process and intervening in family, this is the Richard Wilbur poem. I found it. It's called The Writer. And as you feel about Ginsberg, I have a special place in my heart for Richard Wilbur because I heard him read when I was in college, and I just never looked back.
Yes.
And this is one of them that I heard him read. The Writer. In her room at the prow of the house, where light breaks and the windows are tossed with linden, my daughter is writing a story. I pause in the stairwell, hearing from her shut door a commotion of typewriter keys like a chain hauled over a gunwale. Young as she is, the stuff of her life is a great cargo, and some of it heavy. I wish her a lucky passage. But now it is she who pauses, as if to reject my thought and its easy figure. A stillness greatens in which the whole house seems to be thinking, and then she is at it again with a bunched clamor of strokes, and again is silent. I remember the day's starling, which was trapped in that very room 2 years ago, how he stole in, lifted a sash, and retreated, not to affright it, and how for a helpless hour through the crack of the door we watched the sleek, wild, dark, and iridescent creature batter against the brilliance, drop like a glove to the hard floor of the desktop, and wait then, humped and bloody, for the wits to try it again, and how our spirits rose when, suddenly sure, it lifted off from the chair back, beating a smooth course for the right window and clearing the sill of the world. It was always a matter, my darling, of life or death, as I had forgotten. I wish what I wished you before, but harder. And in just that beautiful metaphor of sad and struggling of the bird trying to make its escape, and her trying to escape that block into writing, which he had experienced, I'm sure, many times in his, whether it be story or poems. Do you have another?
Yeah, so, as I say, bringing the books. This is the book to me. This is the book that brought me to poetry. So I think in 8th grade, the teacher said, come in with a poem you want to talk about tomorrow. and I pulled this book, this very book.
That very book.
Louis Untermeyer's Modern American and Modern British Poetry off the shelf in my parents' bedroom. And discovered, among other people, Walt Whitman, who talks. Walt Whitman is so much about himself, and he's about the world, but himself in the world, and he's certainly not shy about his feelings. He proclaims so loud, he yawps, including about poetry. So, just a couple of lines from A Song of Myself. He says, "Loaf with me on the grass, loose that stop from your throat. Not words, nor music, or rhyme I want, not custom or lecture, not even the best. Only the lull I like, the hum of your valved voice." He wants to be, he's aware that he is not writing in a tradition that, well, he is writing in a tradition, but it's unlike how other people have followed that tradition. He also, in a separate poem, actually it's from a part of a bigger poem, but "The Muse in the New World. Come, Muse, migrate from Greece and Ionia, cross out, please, those immensely overpaid accounts." This is going to be an American poetry, and he is so of America. I think he also says something like, if I'm walking by, I don't know if that's part of Song of Myself or just a separate little poem, and I see you standing, why shouldn't I both a old hippie's idea of why can't I talk to a stranger, and a poet's idea, why can't I speak directly? I'm not talking to the academy. I'm not writing in Greek. I'm talking with your words and words you know, and words we can share.
That's a good place to wind it up. Poets really are speaking poetry, and what they talk about when they talk about poetry is, really speaking from the heart, speaking from, that place where they feel a kind of oneness very often. So have you got anything, one more poem for us, or would you like me to wind it up? We just have a few minutes.
I'll give you a short one, and then you could give us one. So later on, I found E. Cummings' little poem about Louis Untermeyer.
Uh-huh.
And it just, unlike most Cummings' poem, is a little rhyme. Mr. U will not be missed, who as an anthologist sold many on the few, not excluding Mr. U.
Not excluding Mr. U. Okay, and here's one from Theodore Retke, which is very similar. It's called To an Anthologist. Yes, even the devil should have his due. Though I've had all the praise that need be, you don't like me, and I don't like you. Still, I do wish that you'd read me. So there it is, that message in the bottle that I like to describe about poetry. And I want to thank you again, Mark, for being with us today, sharing your knowledge and your insights about poetry. And I hope you come back again when we can maybe meet together with Frank Crowley, the mastermind of this.
Anytime I can talk about poetry, I'm happy.
Okay, me too. All right, thank you very much.